In January 1945, the gates of Auschwitz were finally opened, revealing a horror that the world had never seen before. This was no ordinary prison camp. Auschwitz was a factory of death, where over 1.1 million people were tortured, starved, and murdered. It was a place where hope died the moment you entered, and the only escape for many was death. The nightmare in Auschwitz begins even before the prisoners arrived. They were crammed into overcrowded cattle cars for days without food, water, or toilets. Packed so tightly they couldn't sit down. Many suffocated or died from dehydration during the journey. When the trains finally stopped, guards with barking dogs shouted orders, forcing the prisoners out of the wagons. Families clung to each other in confusion and fear, but their moments together were short. As soon as they stepped onto the platform, the infamous selection began. SS officers like Joseph Mengele coldly pointed left or right. The elderly, pregnant women, the sick and children were sent straight to the gas chambers. Mothers were torn from their children. Fathers watched their families disappear into the distance. Most had no idea they had just said their final goodbyes. For those who survived the selection, the torment was just beginning. They were marched into the camp, where their clothes were stripped away. Naked and shivering, they were herded into rooms to have their heads shaved. Clumps of hair were torn from their scalps, leaving behind raw, bleeding patches. Women, in particular, sobbed as they watched their dignity taken from them in seconds. The prisoners were then tattooed with numbers on their forearms, erasing their identities. They were no longer human beings with names, families, and lives. They were reduced to numbers in the Nazi death machine. Life in Auschwitz was a slow death. The prisoners were crammed into barracks, sleeping on wooden planks stacked in 3 tiers. Each plank held 6 to 8 people, but there was hardly enough room for one. They had no mattresses, no blankets, and no privacy. The barracks were freezing in the winter and suffocating in the summer. The stench of sweat, excrement, and death was inescapable. Food was scarce and barely edible. Breakfast was a cup of black coffee or water. Lunch was watery soup made from rotting vegetables. And dinner was a slice of bread that often contained sawdust. Starvation was a constant reality. Prisoners fought over scraps of food like animals, and those who couldn't keep up with the harsh conditions simply wasted away. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread rapidly. With no medical care, even small injuries became life-threatening. Prisoners often died surrounded by others who were too weak to move or even mourn their loss. The dead were dragged out every morning, their bodies piled like trash outside the barracks. Every aspect of life in Auschwitz was controlled by fear. The guards used brutality to break the prisoners' spirits. Even minor infractions like speaking without permission or not standing up straight were met with violent punishments. One of the worst punishments was being sent to Block 11, known as the Death Block. Here, prisoners were subjected to unimaginable tortures. Some were locked in standing cells, tiny spaces where they couldn't sit or lie down. These cells were so small that prisoners could only stand, pressed against the walls, for days or even weeks. Many died from exhaustion. Other punishments included flogging, where prisoners were tied to a wooden post and whipped until their backs were torn open. Some were forced to kneel on sharp stones for hours under the blazing sun, their knees bleeding and swollen. Others were starved for days or forced to carry heavy stones back and forth until they collapsed. One of the most infamous tortures was the Boger swing, invented by SS officer Wilhelm Boger. Prisoners were tied to an iron bar by their wrists and ankles, hanging in the air as guards beat them mercilessly. The pain was so excruciating that many died during the torture. The floors of Block 11 were stained with blood, teeth, and flesh, a silent testament to the suffering endured there. The women of Auschwitz faced additional horrors. Female guards like Maria Mandel and Irma Grace were notorious for their cruelty. They whipped women for the smallest mistakes, unleashed dogs on them, and even forced them to strip naked in freezing temperatures as a form of humiliation. Sexual violence was common. Guards used women as objects, abusing them repeatedly without consequence. Many women were left broken, both physically and emotionally. Pregnant women were often killed immediately, but some were forced to give birth in the barracks, surrounded by filth and death. Their babies were taken and killed, often thrown into pits or burned alive. For those who weren't killed immediately, work became a form of slow execution. Prisoners were forced to perform backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset, often in freezing snow or scorching heat. They carried heavy stones, dug trenches, or worked in factories producing materials for the German war effort. The Nazis called it extermination through labor. Work was designed to kill. Prisoners were given impossible quotas to meet, and those who failed were beaten or executed. Many collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies too weak to continue. Guards would simply shoot them and move on. The ultimate punishment in Auschwitz was death in the gas chambers. Prisoners were told they were going to take showers, but instead, they were packed into sealed rooms. The doors were locked, and Zyklon B gas was released. The victims screamed and clawed at the walls, desperately trying to escape. Within minutes, silence fell. The bodies were dragged out by the Sonderkommando, a group of Jewish prisoners forced to assist with the killings. They had to search the bodies for gold teeth and valuables, cut the hair from women's corpses, and burn the remains in massive crematoriums. Refusing these tasks meant certain death. The Sonderkommando lived in constant torment, knowing they were helping the Nazis murder their own people. Many were executed after a few months to hide the evidence of the atrocities. In Auschwitz, death was everywhere. It came from starvation, disease, torture, or the gas chambers. Over 1.1 million men, women, and children died there, their lives stolen by unimaginable cruelty. For those who survived, the scars, both physical and emotional, would never heal. The story of Auschwitz is a reminder of the depths of human evil. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, one that must never be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Do like this video and subscribe to our channel for more historical videos like this.